Hello everyone, welcome back to Dudes Brews. Today I've got my literal and figurative lager brewing hat on because I'm going to be talking to you about my top tips for brewing consistent and high quality lagers. So if you're interested in upping your crispy boy game, let's get into it. So before we get into these tips, I just want to make it clear that I'm making a few assumptions here in terms of if you're moving on to lagers, you've probably got the basic kind of brewing techniques and some of the key concepts and techniques down already for brewing any type of beer consistently. And that will include things like having your sanitation and cleaning on point. So we're going to be avoiding any issues with infections and off flavors that come about through that vector, and also having a setup where you're going to be able to manage temperature effectively. So that said, let's get into tip number one. So for me, we've got to start off with yeast health and specifically yeast pitching rate. I think it's the thing that's paid the most dividends for me over the years in terms of best kind of bang for your buck. And it will increase the cost potentially of your brewing, but I think it's worth it. Now, rather than giving you some arbitrary kind of numbers here, this is going to be massively dependent on the batch size that you're brewing, the original gravity that you're brewing, the yeast, type of yeast that you're starting with, whether it be wet or dry. If we are talking about wet yeast, then we're also going to have to consider the age of that. All of those things together mean that really what we want to be looking at is using some sort of yeast pitching calculator rather than just assuming that we're going to be able to use 1, 2, 3 packets of yeast or a standard kind of starter size or whatever you want to do. That said, one thing I will recommend is that if you are using liquid yeast, that you pretty much always make a starter if you're brewing lagers. Even if we're looking at the yeast packs manufacturers that do have the higher cell counts in them, generally speaking, unless we're brewing a very sort of low ABV lager, you are going to be needing more yeast, ideally, than what you're going to get in even those kind of 200 billion cell packs. And that's assuming that they are super fresh and you haven't lost any vitality. So lots of people might tell you anecdotally that they have pitched single packs of yeast or they've used single packs of liquid yeast and everything's been fine and that their beers have turned out well. And I've had a few experiences like that myself. More power to you. But if we want to make sure that we are consistent and we're getting the best results every time, and again, this is from my own personal experience, I've found that one of the best guarantees of that is to make sure that we're pitching ideally at or above the ideal pitch rate for that beer. Now, with lagers specifically, we are generally going to be fermenting cooler, so that's going to mean that the yeast is going to be working a bit slower, taking a little bit longer to kind of propagate and multiply within your beer. So we need to give it every chance from the beginning to basically get going. So what I really want to see when I'm brewing lagers ideally is to have a lag time which isn't really that much different to when I'm brewing with ale yeast at a higher temperature, because I'm pitching enough yeast that is vital and active into the beer so that it's going to get going and start fermenting fairly quickly. Yes, it probably will still be a little bit slower than particularly some of the more active kind of ale yeast that you might be using, but I want to, bring that gap as close as possible and not be having the beer taking several days to get going. So what does that mean in practical terms? I've already mentioned with liquid yeast that I think you should always be making a starter of some kind. Again, go back to your yeast pitch calculators and see what you can do there. I do like doing a kind of 2-step starter. That means with a lot of beers, it avoids the need for a gigantic conical flask where you're going to be trying to make up 4 or 5 litre sort of starters. So you can split the starter across 2 batches and reduce the volume of it, so you might be able to do a couple of 1.5 to 2 litre starters to get up to a suitable yeast count. Another benefit of that I've found is that if I want to pitch the yeast in while it is actively fermenting, then it's going to be done in the case of a 2-step or more starter with a much smaller volume. So I wouldn't necessarily want to do that if I'm pitching in, say, a 4 or 5 litre starter, where that's going to be diluting the wort down for the beer that I've brewed and potentially altering the flavour profile quite significantly. But if we're looking at 1.5 to 2 litres, I'm not going to be as concerned about that. That's not something that you necessarily have to do. You can obviously still chill the starter down, decant off the spent wort, and pitch in the yeast, as a lot of you may have tried already. I will do that quite a lot as well. But recently I have found that using a kind of actively fermenting starter, so just getting towards the end of the starter being fermented out and pitching it then, can again help to give you a really quick start to fermentation and avoid too much of a lag time. So again, I'm not really going to give you any kind of arbitrary numbers for this. Look at the yeast calculator, work it out from there, and basically just try and target a number that is at least as high as the target, if not a little bit higher. Generally, I'll try and err on the side of going a bit over if possible. You are much less likely to suffer issues from over pitching, certainly if it's only by a small amount, than you are with under pitching yeast, generally speaking. What about dry yeast? So again, the yeast calculators will give you an indication for this. Generally speaking, I think you're going to be looking at 2 packets as an absolute minimum here. And we're talking here, by the way, about sort of 19 to 23 litre batches. So that's 5 to 6 gallons for our North American friends and anyone else working in imperial measures. But yeah, looking at a 19 to 23 litre batch, I think you're going to be looking at least 2 packets pretty much for anything, unless it's super low gravity. You can probably, around about 4% beers, 2 packets should be okay. But most of the time I'm generally going to be looking at kind of 3 packets, and that would be typically with me brewing sort of 4.5 to 5.5% lagers, 3 packets of dry yeast. If you're going anywhere above that, or you're making a significantly bigger batch size, then again, refer to the yeast calculator, but you're probably going to need maybe another packet or 2 on top of that. So yes, I know that's going to potentially get expensive, but at the end of the day, a single yeast packet is not really going to deliver the kind of yeast count that you're looking for in terms of an ideal lager pitching rate. So it is what it is, but I think that investment is worthwhile. So that's all I've got to say about yeast. That's probably the one that I will talk the longest about, but let's move on to tip number 2. So this one is ingredient quality. Now with lagers, you are generally looking at a fairly simple recipe. It's all about how clean the beer comes across, and that is obviously partly down to fermentation, as we've been discussing beforehand. But these things do mean that off flavors are going to be much more obvious, so we need to avoid those. But it's also going to be much more apparent if you are kind of skimping on ingredient quality, or if there are any issues with your ingredients in terms of their freshness, or how they've been stored, or just their general quality overall. So it really does pay, as far as I'm concerned, for making that extra step to maybe buy the slightly more premium malt, making sure that you've got the freshest hops available, and that basically you're putting in the best ingredients that you possibly can. Even more so when we're looking at traditional lagers. So if you want a really authentic and great tasting German lager or Czech Pilsner, then we're going to really want to be putting in the best quality kind of Bohemian style malt into that. And for me specifically, a lot of the beers that I've made in that kind of category, I'm looking at floor malted Bohemian Pilsner as the best of the best, as far as I'm concerned, or at least in terms of the malts that I've tried. And again, yes, that's going to come at a cost, but I've tried beers with that malt versus cheaper or more standard malts in them, and it is obvious. So you will get benefit from it. You will see it in the finished beer, especially where you've got these beers where it is very malt focused. So if you want to brew a great Munich Helles, then it's going to be all about the malt. You want a really good base malt in there. Doesn't necessarily have to be the floor malted version. I think some of those, there's other Weyermann malts which are fantastic. I'm sure there's various other German maltsters that you could use, and you'll also have your own domestic producers that might be malting kind of German varieties that are either, like over here in the UK, we have a couple of maltsters who are growing heritage Pilsner malts and malting them in the UK. So you've got Hannah Malt, for example, from Crisp, and I believe Warminster have produced a Czech style floor malted Pilsner malt with Utopian. I think I'll check that, but I believe that's the case. So again, doesn't necessarily have to be imported, but you do want to look for something that's kind of specific to that style ideally, and the best quality that you can find. Now, obviously there are horses for courses on this one, so you don't necessarily need to use that really top quality kind of malt if you are looking to brew, say, an American lager, for example, where the flavour profile might be less malty and a little bit more plain, for want of a better word. You might be brewing a beer that is more hop focused and contemporary in style, so things like your West Coast Pilsners, New Zealand Pilsners, that sort of thing. I'm not necessarily going to waste a really expensive base malt on those where the hops would probably overpower it. If I'm going for the absolutely best possible version of that I can make, I might go all out and put floor malted Bohemian Pils in there as well. But generally speaking, I'm going to be looking for a simple kind of lager malt, so it can be a domestically produced lager malt or one of the slightly more cheap European malts. So a good example of that, which I find is a good general purpose but pretty decent quality malt, is the Dingerman's Pilsner malt. So that's been on offer from various people in the UK quite a few times recently, so you can pick it up at a good price, and a really good kind of all-purpose lager malt I've found. But yeah, not quite up there with your Weyermann floor malted Pils and so on. But yeah, malt wise, make sure you invest in the best quality that you can that's relevant to that recipe, and you'll reap the benefits, and in a lot of cases it will be noticeable where you've actually invested a little bit of extra funds into that. With hops, not just the freshness and the quality, but also think about the format that they're in as well. So pellet hops are great. I use pellet hops almost all of the time, but I did do the Malt Miller Budvar recipe kit last year, or maybe it was this year, can't remember, but that had whole hops in it, and it did seem to make a difference. So again, look at the kind of recipe that you're doing. If it's something where whole hop cones might be recommended or be more authentic, there may be a reason for that in terms of the flavour that they deliver. People do talk about a difference in flavour that you get from using whole hops. Yes, they can be a massive pain in the arse for certain systems to use them, but it seemed to pay off in that beer particularly for me, and that's definitely something that I would consider again if I was looking to brew a really authentic tasting kind of Czech Pilsner. So let's move on to tip number 3, and I couldn't talk about lager without delving into the murky depths of water chemistry. And I'm not going to spend too long talking about this, but I'll just focus on the things that I think are key. And well, first of all, it's having some kind of control over your water chemistry, full stop. I don't think that it's going to rule you out from lager brewing if you don't have access to super soft or even RO water, but you will need to be aware of things and be able to control things like mash pH and, to an extent, the final water profile if you want to get a good result. Again, with lagers, it's very difficult to hide faults, and if you are using high bicarbonate tap water, for example, in the UK, which I know a lot of people would be if they were using the tap water completely untreated, and you are trying to brew a lager, so pale lagers, pilsners, hells, things like that, you're going to really struggle with your mash pH if you don't do anything about that. The end result can be really kind of astringent aftertaste in the beer, quite harsh kind of flavour to it, And yeah, it's again something that isn't necessarily going to make it undrinkable, but it's certainly going to take away from the finish and having a beer that's comparable to something that you might get commercially. So being aware of your water chemistry and what you've actually got and being able to control it, I think, are really important for brewing good lagers. If you do have access to RO water, or you want to use bottled water, that can make it easier to achieve the really soft kind of water profiles and things like that that will be part and parcel of producing authentic Czech Pilsners, for example. But before we think about that, I just want to come back to pH and why that is so important. So that is essentially going to, if your mash pH is too high, extract tannins from the grain when you're mashing, particularly when you're sparging. And that is where you're going to get that harshness and that astringency and that sort of like, yeah, basically that kind of like old tea bag kind of flavour that's going to make you really kind of not enjoy the finish on the beer in a lot of cases. We need to avoid that by controlling the mash pH. And with lagers, for me, certainly in terms of pale lagers, you really want to be targeting the lower end of the mash pH range. That's going to help to, again, give you that really kind of crisp finish as well. So as well as getting it into the most efficient area for conversion and avoiding extracting those harsh tannins, at the lower end of your mash pH range, we're also going to help to improve that finish just by bringing that final pH down in the beer by starting off with as lower mash pH as possible. I like to use phosphoric acid. You don't have to use that. You could use lactic, you could use acidulated malt, various different ways. But again, water chemistry calculators, I use the one in Brewfather, which is fantastic. If you want to get super in-depth with it, the Brewing Water spreadsheet is good. Most of the software comes with reasonably decent water calculators now. Get involved with those. Find out your water profile at home if you are using tap water. I've got an RO system, which I think is ideal. Lets you pretty much recreate any water profile you want and does generally make it easier to get to the mash pH you want without having to add huge amounts of acid, which I certainly would need to do if I was using my own tap water here, which does have very high bicarbonate. So yeah, get that mash pH sorted first of all though, before you do anything else. That is really key. If you are brewing with tap water and you've got high bicarbonate in there, make sure that you are thinking about acidifying the sparge water as well. And this was something that I wasn't aware of when I first started doing water treatment. I would treat the mash water and not necessarily do the sparge water. You can still cause problems there in terms of extracting tannins if your sparge water will bring the pH back up, which it will do if it is untreated and it has a lot of bicarbonate in there. So acidify both mash and sparge if you are using water that needs that to be done. In my personal setup, I use RO water, so I don't really need to acidify the sparge water because it's essentially neutral anyway. It's not going to change the pH of the mash bed as it goes through it. But yeah, we'll save any more on that for maybe a more detailed water chemistry video, which I've been promising for a long time and will eventually get onto at some point. So what about the water profiling? With water profiles for lagers, general rule of thumb is, you want it fairly soft. I would say that for most styles, unless we're kind of venturing into some of the darker lager styles, that we're generally going to be wanting to keep the overall kind of mineral content fairly low. With Czech Pilsners, almost as low as you can possibly get. You might want to just add enough minerals to it so that you've got a reasonable amount of calcium for yeast health and so on. But they seem to do all right in Pilsen, so you can try either way with that. I like to sort of generally aim for probably a maximum of, in total, dissolved solids for lagers, probably no more than about 200, maybe 250 at a push, but generally on the lower side of that, and that's for like the total of all of the minerals added together. Now, one thing I would say is don't neglect the ability to play around with the water profile to kind of tweak it for the particular beer style that you're doing. If you're doing a malt forward beer like a Hell's, maybe a little bit more chloride will help to add that extra body and mouthfeel that you might want to give it a slightly weightier kind of malty flavour. If you're doing Pilsners or hoppy kind of German lagers, leaning a little bit into the sulfate can be good. So even if you have got very low overall quantities, you can still get a little bit of benefit from having a slightly higher sulfate to chloride ratio, or vice versa, depending on the beer style that you're doing. One thing I will say on that front is if you are going into those lagers where you're really going quite high on the hopping rate, so again, West Coast Pilsners and New Zealand Pilsners would be a good example for that. The obvious thing to do might be to go for quite a high sulfate rate like you would have with a West Coast IPA, for example. But I have found that sometimes you might end up with the bitterness becoming a little bit too harsh and potentially a little bit rasping and astringent in that case. So consider maybe going for a more balanced approach, or even flipping it around and going a little bit higher on the chloride for those kinds of beers. That's definitely something that I do with my New Zealand Pilsners, to just kind of soften the bitterness and the hop presence a little bit, and that can really help because the beer is going to be quite dry and crisp anyway. So just remember it, you've got various dials there to kind of control how the beer finishes in terms of that hop presence and so on. Okay, so yeah, we'll leave it there for water chemistry. I'm sure there might be a few questions and comments on that one. Do feel free to throw them in, and any suggestions you've got yourself on that front. That's always a topic that's ripe for debate. So, fourth and final tip, and this one is patience. Probably sounds like an obvious one for lager brewing, but as somebody who's been a proponent of kind of fast lagering techniques, and I still use them for pretty much all of the lagers that I brew to some extent, you might think, well, how can you be patient but also be trying to get the fermentation done quicker than you would normally? And for me, this is about just making sure that we're patient at the point where we are thinking that a beer's finished, for example, or where we're looking to start crashing the beer down and lagering it, and all those points basically where if you maybe rush the beer through too quickly, you may be opening yourself up to off flavors, or the fermentation not being fully completed, or the beer just not being ready to go on to the next stage. So even if you are doing a fast lager method, make sure that you absolutely are at final gravity. I've certainly made the mistake before where I've ended up kegging it too soon, and what was a clean beer at that point has then developed off flavors afterwards because it wasn't actually fully fermented out and the yeast hadn't had a chance to consume all of those compounds that can potentially lead to issues like acetaldehyde or diacetyl, or those kind of things. So you can be quick, but you can be patient at the same time, I guess, is the mantra here. And yes, some people might like to try out the genuinely patient methods where you're going for super slow fermentation schedules, you're doing low and slow diacetyl rest. So it's been really interesting to see some of that kind of coming back into the home brewing world recently, in terms of the kind of like method that Budvar use being publicized quite a bit through the Malt Millers videos and the recipe kits that they released for that. Utopian in the UK essentially use a very similar method for a lot of their beers, which they discussed at BrewCon when we were last there. So yeah, it can be, you can apply this in different ways, but I think that it's really about just making sure the yeast is definitely finished when it is. It's about not rushing through your fermentation schedule just because you're doing it at arbitrary set points based on timing, checking gravities of where they are supposed to be, making sure that you do give it a little bit of time after you think it's hit final gravity. I will generally, as a rule of thumb, try and make sure that I'm leaving it at a diacetyl rest temperature for at least a couple of days, and then I'm probably going to leave it a little bit longer still after that. Recently started looking at things like soft crashing rather than fast crashing. Fast crashing can potentially stress the yeast out, and again might introduce some off flavors through that. So yeah, we can still get our lagers turned around fairly quickly. 2 weeks or a little bit more is easily achievable. If you're using pressure fermentation on top of that, which I do, and you are ramping up temperatures and things like that, you can start off at a lower lagering temperature or fermentation temperature even, and then get the beer to finish off fairly quickly. But just be careful at that point where you're thinking about kegging it. Give the yeast a chance to drop out a little bit first of all for a start. Make sure it's finished. You might want to do things like forced diacetyl tests at that point as well, which is a good idea. Checking that you haven't got any traces of acetaldehyde and things like that, which can be indicative of the beer being taken off of the yeast too quickly or the fermentation not being fully complete. Yeah, so give it a chance to do its thing basically, and be patient, even if you're trying to get it done quickly, I guess is the moral of the story there. So yeah, that's it for lager brewing tips. If you want to see an even more in-depth discussion of this, go and check out the Hop Edition episode that we did, which focused on advanced lagering techniques. We discussed a lot of the things that I've talked about here in a little bit more detail. We also covered a few other things like decoction mashing, for example, and shared all of our own experiences. So it wasn't just from me, it was between the three of us on that episode, and had some really good discussions. So go and check us out on the link in the description. You can find us on all the usual podcast providers as well. And if you enjoyed this video, do make sure you hit the various buttons that will help me out. So like the video, drop a comment in, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. It does help and it's appreciated. Yeah, let me know what you think. If you've got any other things that you think are really crucial for turning out good lagers, chuck that in the comments as well. Look forward to having a discussion about that, and I will catch you on the next video. Cheers, everybody.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness or duder or, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.